power reveals a person's true nature much faster than poverty ever could. Sitting in a plush, velvet booth of a five-star Manhattan restaurant, a billionaire executive thought nothing of humiliating the exhausted woman refilling his water glass. He saw only a worn-out uniform and a bowed head, an easy target for his arrogant amusement and corporate stress. What he failed to realize was that the quiet, unassuming woman enduring his cruel jokes held the absolute power to dismantle his entire empire before dessert was even served. Humiliation is a very dangerous game when you have no idea who is actually keeping the score. The dining room of L'Etoile was a sanctuary for the elite, a dimly lit cavern of mahogany, brass, and hushed conversations where fortunes were made and broken over plates of truffle risotto. For Beatrice Hayes, it was simply a loud, physically demanding purgatory. Her feet throbbed in her black orthopedic shoes, her apron was faintly stained with balsamic glaze, and her patience was wearing dangerously thin. Yet her face remained a mask of practiced, professional serenity. At table 4, the center of the room's subtle gravity, sat Richard Sterling. Richard was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. As the CEO of Sterling Cybernetics, a massive data security firm, he possessed a reputation for being ruthless, brilliant, and entirely devoid of empathy. Tonight, he was dining with 3 major investors, Charles Wentworth, Harrison Cole, and a quiet, observing man named Dominic Reed. They were celebrating a victory that had not yet been finalized, and Richard was holding court with the arrogant swagger of a king who believed his borders were impenetrable. "I'm telling you, Charles," Richard boomed, his voice carrying just a fraction too loudly over the polite murmur of the restaurant. "The acquisition is practically done. The seller is some anonymous basement dweller hiding behind a proxy firm. They developed a decent encryption key, sure, but they have no idea how to leverage it in the real world. I'll walk into that boardroom on Friday, slide a check across the table for half of what they're asking, and they'll take it, because people like that are terrified of real power." Beatrice approached the table quietly, carrying a silver pitcher of iced water. She had learned long ago how to make herself invisible, a necessary skill for a waitress serving the financial titans of New York. She stepped to Richard's right, waiting for a break in his animated gesturing to refill his crystal goblet. "It's about leverage," Richard continued, swirling the expensive Barolo in his glass. "You find their weakness, you exploit it, and you remind them of their place." As Beatrice tipped the pitcher, Richard suddenly threw his arm back to emphasize his point, his expensive suit sleeve colliding violently with her wrist. The heavy silver pitcher jerked. A splash of ice-cold water spilled over the rim, landing directly on the sleeve of Richard's bespoke Italian jacket and splashing onto the pristine white tablecloth. The table went dead silent. Beatrice immediately righted the pitcher, grabbing a linen cloth from her apron. "I'm so sorry, sir. Please let me get that for you." Richard did not move. He stared at the wet spot on his sleeve, and then slowly turned his head to look at Beatrice. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, were devoid of any understanding or forgiveness. He looked at her not as a human being who had experienced an accident, but as a defective piece of machinery that had ruined his evening. "Do you know how much this jacket costs?" Richard asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper that was far more intimidating than a shout. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling. I didn't mean to." "Of course you didn't mean to," Richard interrupted, an ugly sneer twisting his features. "Meaning to do something implies foresight, planning, and a basic level of competence, traits that are clearly absent in someone whose peak in life is carrying a water pitcher." Harrison Cole shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Charles Wentworth offered a quiet, sycophantic chuckle. Beatrice kept her face neutral, though her jaw tightened under her skin. "I will have the dry cleaning bill sent to the restaurant's management, sir. I apologize for the disruption." "A dry cleaning bill," Richard repeated, laughing dryly. "How quaint. You think a few dollars makes up for the sheer incompetence I have to deal with every day? This is the problem with this city. Too many people perfectly content with mediocrity. Tell me, what goes through your mind when you wake up in the morning? Do you aspire to pour water without splashing it? Or is that too high of a bar?" "Richard, leave it," Dominic muttered quietly, glancing at Beatrice with a flicker of pity. "It was an accident." "No, Dominic, it's a symptom," Richard snapped, his gaze never leaving Beatrice. "It's a symptom of people who don't understand the value of flawless execution. People who will spend their entire lives fetching and carrying for those of us who actually build the world. She's a plate carrier. And worse, a clumsy one." He turned back to Beatrice, his voice dripping with condescension. "Run along now. Go fetch some bread or whatever it is you do when you aren't ruining expensive clothing. And send the manager. I want a different server." Beatrice stood completely still for 3 seconds. She looked at Richard Sterling. She didn't look at his suit, or his Rolex, or his defensive posture. She looked right into the arrogant, hollow center of his eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile ghosted across her lips. "Right away, sir," Beatrice said softly, her voice perfectly steady. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." She turned and walked away, her posture straight, her head held high. She did not look back as Richard demanded the attention of the maitre d'. She simply walked through the swinging doors of the kitchen, untied her stained apron, and folded it neatly on the prep counter. She had seen everything she needed to see. The neon lights of Brooklyn bled through the blinds of Beatrice's modest third-floor walk-up apartment. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of L'Etoile. The walls were lined with overflowing bookshelves, the furniture was second-hand and utilitarian, and the kitchen counter was cluttered with empty coffee cups. But dominating the small living room was a custom-built, liquid-cooled computer rig connected to 4 massive, high-definition monitors. This was the nerve center of BH Innovations. Beatrice tossed her orthopedic shoes into the corner with a heavy sigh and collapsed into her ergonomic desk chair. The screens woke up immediately, illuminating her face in a soft, blue glow. Lines of complex code, secure communication channels, and real-time financial data painted the digital canvas in front of her. She wasn't just a waitress. In fact, she didn't need the money from the restaurant at all. Beatrice had kept the job at L'Etoile for 2 reasons. It provided health insurance for her ailing mother while her startup was in its infancy, and more importantly, it kept her grounded. The tech world was full of massive egos and dangerous hubris. Pouring water and clearing plates was her personal anchor, a way to observe the unvarnished reality of human nature, specifically, the nature of the wealthy men who thought they ran the world. And tonight, Richard Sterling had shown her exactly who he was. Her secure phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID read Simon Vance. No, wait, just Simon. Simon Carmichael was her lead attorney, the only man who knew the true identity behind BH Innovations. "Tell me you aren't still awake, checking the server loads." Simon's gravelly voice came through the speaker. "I'm awake," Beatrice replied, pulling up a financial dossier on Sterling Cybernetics. "And I'm looking at Richard Sterling's quarterly projections. They're bleeding, Simon. They're hemorrhaging enterprise clients because their legacy firewall can't handle the new decentralized network attacks." "Exactly," Simon said. "Which is why he is desperate for your Aegis protocol. It's the only patch on the market that can seamlessly integrate into his existing architecture without requiring a total system overhaul. He needs you, Beatrice. But he's playing hardball. His latest offer came in an hour ago. He wants to slash the purchase price from $45 million to $30 million, claiming our tech is untested in the corporate sector. Beatrice scoffed, her eyes scanning the data. He knows it's tested. He knows it's foolproof. He's just trying to bully a faceless entity to appease his board of directors. He's demanding a face-to-face meeting on Friday to finalize the terms, Simon continued. He said he won't sign a contract worth tens of millions without looking the architect in the eye. I told his assistant we would consider it. Do you want me to go in your place? I can act as the proxy. Keep your name out of it. Beatrice leaned back in her chair, recalling the sensation of the icy water hitting the table and the cruel, dismissive laughter that followed. A plate carrier. A symptom of incompetence. No, Beatrice said softly, a dangerous edge creeping into her tone. No, Simon. I think it's time BH Innovations stepped out of the shadows. I'll meet with him personally. Are you sure? Simon asked, sounding surprised. You've guarded your anonymity fiercely for 3 years, going into Sterling's territory. He's a shark, Beatrice. He will try to intimidate you, talk down to you, and corner you into accepting his $30 million. Let him try, Beatrice murmured, pulling up a blank legal document on her center screen. I want you to draft a new contract, Simon. Use the framework we discussed last week, but I'm making some adjustments. The price is no longer $45 million. You want to lower it to meet him in the middle? No, Beatrice said, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. The new purchase price is $65 million. Non-negotiable. 65! Simon choked on his end of the line. Beatrice, that's a $20 million hike overnight. He'll walk away. His ego won't allow him to accept that kind of counteroffer. He won't walk, Beatrice stated factually. Without the Aegis protocol, his company's stock will crash by the 3rd quarter when the next wave of data breaches hits his clients. He has no alternative, and he knows it. Furthermore, add a clause, immediate transfer of ownership of the proprietary algorithm, but I retain an advisory board seat with full auditing privileges for 2 years. He will absolutely hate that. I am counting on it. Beatrice smiled, staring at the flashing cursor on her screen. He likes to talk about flawless execution. He likes to talk about leverage. I'm going to show him exactly what leverage looks like when it isn't carrying a water pitcher. All right, Simon said, a hint of amusement in his voice. I'll have the paperwork drawn up and printed by tomorrow evening. What time is the meeting? Friday at 10 a.m. at his headquarters. I'll be there, Simon promised. Get some sleep, Beatrice. You have a big week ahead. Beatrice ended the call. She didn't sleep. Instead, she spent the rest of the night reviewing every line of code, every legal loophole, and every weakness in Richard Sterling's corporate armor. She had endured the mockery of men like him for years. She had been invisible by choice, building an empire in the dark while they strutted in the light. Friday was going to be an education for Mr. Sterling, an expensive one. The headquarters of Sterling Cybernetics was a monument to corporate intimidation, a towering obelisk of dark glass and steel piercing the Manhattan skyline. It was designed to make anyone approaching it feel profoundly small. The lobby was a vast expanse of white marble and minimalist art, guarded by security personnel who looked more like private military contractors than front desk attendants. It was 9:45 a.m. on Friday. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the massive, polished mahogany table in his top-floor executive boardroom. He was wearing a fresh, immaculate charcoal suit, a replacement for the one ruined earlier in the week. He adjusted his silk tie, his reflection caught in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Are we ready, Dominic?" Richard asked, not turning around. Dominic, looking slightly harried, flipped through a sleek leather portfolio. "Yes, Richard. But I have to advise caution. The seller's proxy lawyer, Simon Carmichael, has been entirely silent since we sent over the revised $30 million offer. We don't know who is actually walking through those doors. It could be an entire team of Silicon Valley venture capitalists." Richard scoffed, turning away from the window. "It's not a team. It's some brilliant but socially inept coder who stumbled onto a gold mine and hired a decent lawyer. I've dealt with their kind 100 times. They crumble under pressure. The moment they step into this room and see what real corporate power looks like, they'll sign our offer just to get out of the building. We hold the cards, Dominic. They need our infrastructure to scale. They have the patent, Richard," Dominic reminded him gently. "Without Aegis, the Department of Defense contract falls through next month." "Which is why we are buying it," Richard snapped. "Just be ready with the pens." Down in the lobby, the elevator doors chimed open. Beatrice Hayes stepped out. She looked nothing like the exhausted woman who had served truffle risotto a few nights prior. Gone were the stained apron and the orthopedic shoes. Today, Beatrice wore a sharply tailored, deep navy blue power suit that fit her perfectly, paired with a crisp white silk blouse and understated, elegant stiletto heels. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun to keep out of the food, was styled in a sleek, professional blowout. She carried a slim, carbon fiber briefcase. Beside her walked Simon, looking every bit the ruthless corporate shark in his own right. "Nervous?" Simon asked quietly as they approached the security desk. "Not in the slightest," Beatrice replied, her voice cool and steady. "Are the documents in order?" "Signed, sealed, and ready to be deployed like a tactical strike," Simon confirmed with a grim smile. They presented their credentials to the security desk. The guard checked the manifest. "Ah, yes. Mr. Carmichael and guest. Mr. Sterling is expecting you on the 52nd floor. Executive elevator bank, straight ahead." The ride up was silent. Beatrice watched the floor numbers tick higher, feeling the atmospheric pressure change in the cabin. She thought about the countless hours she had spent in her tiny apartment, coding until her eyes bled. She thought about her father's medical bills, now entirely paid off by her preliminary consulting work. And she thought about the cold, dead look in Richard Sterling's eyes when he had called her incompetent. The elevator chimed. Floor 52. The doors parted to reveal a plush reception area. A perfectly groomed assistant stood up immediately. "Mr. Carmichael, please follow me. Mr. Sterling is waiting in the main boardroom." Beatrice and Simon followed the assistant down a wide hallway, lined with modern art and frosted glass offices. The air hummed with the quiet, intense energy of high-stakes commerce. Finally, they reached a set of double oak doors. The assistant pushed them open and stepped aside. "The representatives for BH Innovations," the assistant announced. Beatrice stepped through the threshold, Simon a half step behind her. The boardroom was massive. At the far end, silhouetted against the bright morning sky, stood Richard Sterling. Dominic sat to his right, legal pads ready. Richard pasted on a predatory, welcoming smile and began to walk forward, his hand extended. "Welcome to Sterling Cybernetics. I'm Richard Sterling and I—" His voice died in his throat. Richard stopped walking, his outstretched hand slowly lowered to his side. His pale blue eyes widened, locking onto Beatrice's face. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzing confusion. He blinked hard, as if trying to clear a hallucination. He recognized the bone structure, the calm, unyielding eyes, the posture. But it couldn't be. It was impossible. "You," Richard breathed, all of his practiced corporate bravado momentarily shattering. Beatrice did not break eye contact. She walked forward with slow, deliberate confidence until she reached the opposite side of the mahogany table. She placed her carbon fiber briefcase down with a soft, authoritative click. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. It was the exact same soft, steady tone she had used when apologizing for the spilled water. "I believe we have some business to conclude. I am Beatrice Hayes, founder, lead developer, and sole proprietor of BH Innovations." Dominic looked rapidly back and forth between Richard and Beatrice, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the room's atmosphere. "Richard," Dominic whispered, "do you know her?" Richard's face drained of color. The memory of the restaurant hit him like a physical blow. The mockery, the cruel jokes about incompetence, the demand to have her replaced. He looked at the impeccably dressed CEO standing before him, and the terrifying reality of his situation began to dawn on him. The person he had humiliated for sport was the exact same person holding the survival of his company in her hands. Beatrice opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick, leather-bound folder. She slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany until it came to rest directly in front of Richard's frozen hands. "I've reviewed your revised offer of $30 million, Beatrice said smoothly, taking a seat and crossing her legs, "and I found it entirely unacceptable. Inside that folder is the final, non-negotiable contract. The new purchase price for the Aegis Protocol is $65 million, along with a mandatory advisory seat for myself on your board of directors." Richard choked, his hands gripping the edge of the table. 65? That is extortion. We agreed to negotiate around 45. "We did," Beatrice agreed calmly. "But the price of doing business has gone up. Consider the extra $20 million in asshole tax, or if you prefer, a very expensive dry cleaning bill." The silence in the executive boardroom of Sterling Cybernetics was deafening. The $65 million contract sat on the mahogany table like an unexploded bomb, the heavy cream paper seemingly mocking the men in the room. Richard Sterling felt the blood rush to his ears, a high-pitched ringing completely drowning out the ambient hum of the city below. He stared at Beatrice Hayes, searching her calm, unblinking eyes for any sign of a bluff, a crack in her armor, or a hint of the subservient waitress he had tormented just days ago. There was nothing. She was a fortress of absolute certainty. "You have 48 hours to review the terms," Beatrice said, breaking the silence as she stood up, smoothing the front of her navy suit. "My attorney, Mr. Carmichael, has provided all the necessary routing information and the technical handover protocols. If the contract is not signed and executed by 10 a.m. on Monday, the offer is withdrawn permanently. The price will not be negotiated further." Without waiting for a response, Beatrice turned and walked out of the room, her stilettos clicking a sharp, rhythmic death knell for Richard's ego. Simon offered a brief, utterly humorless nod to Dominic before following his client out the heavy oak doors. The moment the doors clicked shut, Richard exploded. He swept his arm across the table, sending a crystal water pitcher, ironically similar to the one at L'Etoile, shattering against the far wall. "Get Decker on the phone!" Richard roared. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "Right now, Dominic! Get Thomas Decker on the line!" Dominic, hands shaking slightly, pulled out his phone and dialed their top corporate investigator. Thomas Decker was a former intelligence officer who specialized in corporate espionage, background checks, and finding the invisible skeletons in the closets of Wall Street's elite. If anyone could find a weakness in Beatrice Hayes, it was him. For the next 24 hours, Richard paced his penthouse apartment like a caged animal. He refused to believe he had been bested by a service worker. There had to be a catch, a stolen line of code, a patent infringement, a dark secret that he could use to leverage her back down to the $30 million they had originally planned to offer. On Saturday evening, Decker arrived at Richard's penthouse. The investigator was a lean, unassuming man with tired eyes, carrying a thick manila folder. He didn't bother with a greeting. He simply dropped the folder onto Richard's glass coffee table. "I pulled everything," Decker said, his voice gravelly. "Financials, academic records, tax returns, even medical histories. You asked me to find the dirt on Beatrice Hayes, Richard." "And?" Richard demanded, leaning forward like a starving man. "What did you find? Fraud? Embezzlement? Who actually wrote the Aegis Protocol?" "She did," Decker said flatly. "Every single line of it. Beatrice Hayes graduated summa cum laude from MIT 6 years ago. She was being headhunted by every major firm in Silicon Valley. Google, Palantir, Cisco. They all wanted her." Richard frowned, confusion warring with his anger. Then what the hell was she doing pouring water at a restaurant in Manhattan? That doesn't make any sense. Decker sighed, dropping into an armchair. 5 years ago, her father, Arthur Hayes, was diagnosed with a severe, incredibly rare degenerative neurological condition. The treatments were experimental, entirely out of pocket, and exclusively available at Mount Sinai Hospital. It bankrupted their family in months. Beatrice dropped off the corporate grid. She needed 2 things immediately: untraceable, flexible cash tips to keep the lights on, and a job with a union-backed, premium health insurance policy to cover her father's baseline care while she coded on the side. Richard stared at the folder. The narrative of the lazy, incompetent plate carrier was dissolving before his eyes, replaced by a terrifying picture of sheer, unyielding discipline. "She worked double shifts at L'Etoile for 4 years, Decker continued, and spent every single night building BH innovations from a makeshift server farm in a Brooklyn walk-up. 3 months ago, Arthur Hayes went into remission. The medical bills stopped, and roughly 2 weeks later, she deployed the beta version of the Aegis Protocol on a darknet security forum. It caught your tech team's eye because it is flawlessly engineered." "I don't care about her sob story," Richard snapped, though his voice lacked its usual venom. "I need leverage. I need a way out of this $65 million extortion." Decker looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "Richard, you aren't listening. There is no leverage. I hacked into her encrypted communications with her lawyer, Simon Carmichael. She isn't bluffing about the deadline. If you don't sign on Monday morning, she has a standing term sheet from CrowdStrike." Richard's stomach dropped. "CrowdStrike?" "Yes," Decker nodded grimly. "And they aren't offering 65. They are offering 75 million plus stock options. She is giving you a discount because the Aegis code was originally tailored to interface with your specific legacy servers. She wants to see her creation deployed perfectly, and your infrastructure is the fastest vehicle for that. But if you try to stall, she will walk, and when she does, CrowdStrike will integrate Aegis, and Sterling Cybernetics will be obsolete by the 3rd quarter. Decker stood up, buttoning his coat. "My advice? Swallow your pride, sign the paper, and pray she doesn't use her new board seat to fire you." Monday morning arrived with the grim inevitability of an execution. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the boardroom, but the dynamic had entirely shifted. He was no longer the apex predator. He was a man cornered by his own hubris. Surrounding the table were the 7 members of the Sterling Cybernetics Board of Directors. These were ruthless venture capitalists, seasoned tech veterans, and men who cared only about quarterly profits. Among them sat Gregory Pierce, a hawkish billionaire who had long coveted Richard's position as CEO. Gregory was currently flipping through the finalized contract Beatrice had delivered on Friday. "Explain this to me, Richard," Gregory demanded, tapping his gold pen against the $65 million figure. "3 days ago, you assured this board that we were acquiring the Aegis Protocol for a maximum of $45 million. Now I am looking at a demand for 65, immediate transfer of funds, and, most alarmingly, a mandatory, immediate appointment of the seller to this very board of directors." Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. It felt too tight. The market conditions changed, Gregory. The seller was aware of our vulnerabilities. They forced our hand. "Forced your hand?" Gregory scoffed loudly. "You are the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. You don't let a faceless basement coder force your hand. And look at this marginal note on page 4. It specifically cites a $20 million arsehole tax. Is this a joke, Richard? Did you insult the seller?" Before Richard could formulate a lie to protect himself, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Beatrice Hayes walked in. She wore a striking tailored suit in a deep charcoal grey. She carried no briefcase today, only a single leather folio. Simon Carmichael flanked her, looking perfectly at ease in the shark tank. "I can answer that, Mr. Pierce," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a scalpel. The board members turned, entirely taken aback by the unannounced intrusion. Security at Sterling Cybernetics was famously tight. No one made it to the 52nd floor without Richard's explicit authorization. "And who the hell are you?" Gregory demanded, standing up. "I am Beatrice Hayes," she replied smoothly, walking to the empty chair directly opposite Richard at the far end of the long table. She sat down, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I am the architect of the Aegis Protocol. And as of 9:45 a.m. this morning, when Mr. Sterling quietly signed the electronic transfer documents in his office to meet my deadline, I am the newest member of this board of directors." A stunned murmur rippled through the room. Gregory whipped his head toward Richard, who was staring fixedly at the tabletop, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Is this true, Richard?" Gregory hissed. "It is," Richard managed to say, his voice thick with defeat. "The funds have been escrowed. The algorithm is ours." "Then let's address your question regarding the arsehole tax, Mr. Pierce," Beatrice continued, commanding the room with effortless authority. "A few nights ago, I had the misfortune of encountering your CEO in a social setting. During that encounter, Mr. Sterling demonstrated a profound lack of judgment, an inability to assess the value of the people around him, and a reckless arrogance that I found deeply concerning." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the faces of the silent board members. "As the creator of Aegis, I was faced with a dilemma," Beatrice explained. "I knew Sterling Cybernetics desperately needed my software to survive the upcoming fiscal year. However, entrusting my life's work to a man who evaluates human worth based on the price tag of a suit is a massive liability. Arrogant men make careless mistakes. They underestimate their opponents. And in the cybersecurity sector, underestimating your opponent is fatal." Beatrice leaned forward slightly. "The extra $20 million was the penalty for his behavior. The board seat is my insurance policy. I am here to ensure that the technology I built is managed with precision, foresight, and respect, qualities that your current CEO currently lacks." Gregory Pierce slowly sat back down, a slow predatory smile spreading across his face. He looked at Beatrice, recognizing a predator of equal, if not greater, caliber. He then looked at Richard, smelling blood in the water. "Well, Ms. Hayes," Gregory said softly, his tone entirely shifted from aggressive to accommodating. It seems we have a great deal to discuss regarding the future leadership of this company. Welcome to the board." Richard Sterling closed his eyes. He had kept his company alive, but in doing so, he had handed the keys to the very woman he had mocked. He was still the CEO, but he knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that Beatrice Hayes was now the one truly in charge. The atmosphere within the glass and steel monolith of Sterling Cybernetics underwent a violent, tectonic shift over the next 3 weeks. Beatrice Hayes did not immediately assume the role of a tyrant. She was far too intelligent for such crude tactics. Instead, she became a phantom in the executive suites. She utilized her newly acquired board seat and her explicitly contracted auditing privileges with terrifying precision. She spent her days in a glass-walled conference room on the 52nd floor, surrounded by towering stacks of financial reports, server logs, and legal contracts. Richard Sterling attempted to maintain his alpha male facade. He strutted through the corridors, barked orders at his subordinates, and deliberately scheduled executive meetings at times he knew Beatrice was reviewing the system architecture. He was desperately trying to project an image of absolute control to his staff and the remaining board members. He believed that if he ignored the waitress-turned-billionaire, she would eventually become overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of corporate governance and retreat to her coding terminal. It was a fatal miscalculation. Beatrice was not overwhelmed, she was hunting. On a rainy Tuesday morning, precisely 21 days after the contract was signed, Beatrice summoned an emergency meeting of the board of directors. She did not ask Richard's permission to use the main boardroom. She simply instructed her attorney, Simon Carmichael, to issue the mandatory legal summons. When Richard pushed through the heavy oak doors, his jaw tightened. The 7 board members were already seated, looking tense and impatient. Gregory Pierce sat near the head of the table, his eyes darting between Richard and Beatrice. But what made the blood drain from Richard's face were the 4 unfamiliar men in sharp, conservative suits sitting along the back wall. They did not look like venture capitalists or tech developers. They looked like undertakers. "What is the meaning of this, Miss Hayes?" Richard demanded, taking his seat at the head of the table. "We have a quarterly earnings call to prepare for. I do not have time for unscheduled theatrics." Beatrice stood calmly at the opposite end of the mahogany table. She wore a tailored, icy grey blazer and held a single encrypted tablet. "The earnings call will have to be postponed, Mr. Sterling," Beatrice stated, her voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "Because the earnings you were planning to report to our shareholders, and by extension, the Securities and Exchange Commission, are entirely fabricated." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Gregory Pierce leaned forward, his hawkish features sharpening. "That is a massive accusation, Beatrice. You are alleging federal securities fraud." "I am not alleging it, Mr. Pierce. I am proving it," Beatrice replied. She gestured to the 4 men at the back of the room. 2 weeks ago, utilizing the audit clauses built into the Aegis acquisition contract, I retained an elite forensic accounting unit from KPMG. I instructed them to execute a deep dive analysis of Sterling Cybernetics discretionary spending, research and development allocations, and offshore vendor payments over the last 36 months. Richard felt a cold sweat break out across his shoulder blades. "You have no authority to authorize a third-party audit of that magnitude without a majority board vote." "Actually, Richard, she does," Simon Carmichael interjected from his seat near the window, casually flipping through a thick legal binder. Clause 4. Subsection B of your signed agreement grants the creator of the Aegis Protocol unilateral authority to audit the host company's financial stability to ensure the technology is not being deployed within an insolvent infrastructure. It is a standard protective measure. You would have known that if you hadn't been so blinded by your own arrogance during the review period. Beatrice tapped her tablet. The massive digital display screen behind her flickered to life, projecting a complex web of financial routing numbers, shell companies, and banking institutions. Sterling Cybernetics has been bleeding capital for 3 years, Beatrice explained, pacing slowly. Mr. Sterling assured the board that this was due to aggressive R&D expansion to combat next-generation malware. However, the KPMG team, utilizing a tracing algorithm I personally coded to penetrate encrypted banking proxies, found that less than 20% of those funds actually went to our engineering departments. She tapped the screen again. The web zoomed in on a specific corporate entity. The remaining 80% was funneled into a private holding company registered in Delaware under the name Apex Ventures LLC. From there, the money was dispersed into various private accounts in the Cayman Islands. "This is slander," Richard roared, slamming his fist onto the table. His pristine corporate mask was fracturing completely. "This is a fabricated attempt to oust me from my own company. I built this empire." "You built an ATM for your own grotesque vanity," Beatrice countered, her voice never rising above a lethal, conversational tone. The screen shifted to display a series of high-definition photographs and invoices. Apex Ventures purchased a 45-meter luxury yacht moored in Monaco. It purchased a penthouse in Dubai. It covered over $2 million in private jet charters for vacations to St. Barthélemy. And, ironically, it covered a rather exorbitant monthly corporate expense account at L'Étoile restaurant, averaging $15,000 a month in vintage wines and truffle dinners. The board members stared at the screen in horrified silence. These were not minor accounting errors. This was systematic, multi-million-dollar embezzlement. "He was bankrupting the company," Beatrice continued. "The Aegis Protocol acquisition was never about protecting our clients. It was a desperate Hail Mary pass. Richard knew the company was going under. He intended to use my technology to artificially inflate the stock price for 2 consecutive quarters, sell his majority shares at the peak, and abandon Sterling Cybernetics before the SEC discovered the hollowed-out shell he left behind." Gregory Pierce stood up, his face a mask of righteous fury. He pointed a trembling finger at Richard. "Is this true? Have you been stealing from us, Richard? From the shareholders?" Richard looked at Gregory, cornered and desperate like a trapped animal. Then a dark, venomous laugh escaped Richard's throat. He looked at Beatrice, his pale blue eyes filled with pure malice. "You think you are so brilliant, little waitress?" Richard sneered. "You think you've uncovered the whole board? If I am going down, I am not going down alone." He turned his venom on Gregory. "Tell her, Gregory. Tell the board about the proxy firm you set up in Geneva. Tell them how you realized the company was failing 6 months ago and started shorting Sterling Cybernetics stock to profit off the impending crash." The room erupted into chaos. Board members shouted over each other. Gregory Pierce turned stark white, stammering defensively as the KPMG auditors diligently took notes in the background. Beatrice stood at the head of the table, watching the titans of industry tear each other to pieces. She did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply watched the inevitable destruction of men who believed the rules of morality and consequence did not apply to their tax bracket. "Quiet," Beatrice commanded. The single word cut through the screaming argument like a gunshot. The room slowly fell back into a tense, breathless silence. She walked over to Richard, leaning over the mahogany table until she was just inches from his face. She looked into his panicked, hollow eyes, the exact same eyes that had looked through her as if she were dirt. "I already know about Mr. Pierce's short positions," Beatrice whispered softly. ensuring only Richard could hear her over the heavy breathing of the board. "I found them on day 3. I just needed you to confess to your own crimes before I dismantled him. Thank you for making my job so much easier." Beatrice stood up straight, addressing the room. "The evidence packet, compiled by KPMG, has already been securely transmitted to the Enforcement Division of the SEC on Vesey Street, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime unit in Lower Manhattan." Richard collapsed back into his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of his body. He was ruined. The execution within the boardroom was not merely swift, it was a surgically precise dismantling of a man's entire existence. Within 30 minutes of Beatrice's presentation, the Sterling Cybernetics Board of Directors, driven by sheer, unadulterated panic and a desperate need to distance themselves from the impending federal bloodbath, held an emergency, on-the-spot vote. The vote to terminate Richard Sterling as Chief Executive Officer was unanimous, echoing like a gavel striking wood. Because the termination was explicitly categorized as "for cause," citing gross financial misconduct, embezzlement, and fiduciary breach, his ironclad employment contract was rendered instantly void. There would be no severance package. His golden parachute was slashed to ribbons. The millions in unvested stock options he had counted on for his retirement were frozen indefinitely, pending the outcome of the federal indictments. He was, in the span of a single hour, stripped of his empire, his immense wealth, and his liberty. "Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the thick, suffocating silence of the room, "security has been notified. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear any personal items from the executive suite. You will be escorted off the premises immediately." Richard could not speak. The arrogant, booming voice that had dominated boardrooms and terrorized service workers for a decade had entirely vanished, leaving behind only the shallow, ragged breathing of a cornered animal. He stood up slowly. He looked infinitely older, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and slack. He cast one final hateful glare at Beatrice, but she did not flinch. She simply looked back at him with the cold, assessing gaze of an auditor reviewing a closed account. Before Richard could even reach the heavy oak doors, they swung open violently. 4 agents wearing navy windbreakers, emblazoned with the yellow letters of the FBI, stepped into the room. They were led by Special Agent Thomas Miller of the Southern District of New York's White-Collar Crime Division. He held up a piece of paper that sealed Richard's fate. "Richard Sterling," Agent Miller announced, his voice carrying the heavy weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The board members gasped, scrambling backward in their expensive leather chairs as the cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around Richard's wrists. The man who had worn bespoke Italian suits and mocked the clumsiness of a waitress was now being aggressively patted down in front of his former peers. He was marched out of the boardroom, down the executive elevator, and directly through the expansive, white marble lobby of his own building. Hundreds of employees stopped and stared as their untouchable CEO was perp-walked out the front glass doors and shoved into the back of a black federal SUV. The legal proceedings over the following 3 months were a relentless, agonizing spectacle of ruin. During his arraignment at the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse, the presiding judge deemed Richard a severe flight risk due to the offshore accounts uncovered by the KPMG forensic team. Bail was initially denied, forcing Richard to spend his first 3 weeks in the grim, unforgiving confines of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. When bail was finally granted, it was set at an astronomical $25 million. Because the Securities and Exchange Commission had successfully filed injunctions to freeze all of his known domestic and international assets, Richard could not post the bond. His high-priced defense attorneys from the prestigious firm, Kirkland & Ellis, filed a motion to withdraw as his counsel, citing his inability to pay their exorbitant retainers. His fiancée, a socialite who had tolerated his arrogance for his bank accounts, broke off the engagement and moved out of their Manhattan penthouse before the FBI even finished executing their search warrants. Eventually, a public defender managed to negotiate a property bond, forcing Richard to completely liquidate his vast Hampton estate and his remaining luxury vehicles just to secure his temporary release pending trial. He was entirely broke. Meanwhile, inside the glass monolith of Sterling Cybernetics, a new era had dawned. The board, terrified of the ongoing federal investigations and heavily reliant on Beatrice's genius to save them from total collapse, officially voted her in as the new chief executive officer. BH Innovations merged its assets with the corporate structure, and Beatrice immediately went to work. She was a force of nature. She restructured the entire corporate hierarchy, ruthlessly purging the toxic, sycophantic culture Richard had cultivated. She redirected the millions of dollars previously funneled into Richard's shell companies, investing heavily back into the R&D departments. More importantly, she established a massive employee welfare and healthcare fund, ensuring that no worker within her enterprise would ever have to choose between their life-saving medical treatments and their dignity. Under her leadership, the Aegis Protocol was deployed flawlessly across their global network, securing critical government defense contracts and permanently stabilizing the company's future. 6 months later, the chilling, unforgiving winds of November swept through the streets of New York. Richard Sterling, out on bail and facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison, was living in a cramped, mold-scented motel room in Queens. His trial was rapidly approaching, and the prosecution's evidence was insurmountable. But hunger and the need to pay for his basic survival had forced him to seek employment. With his face plastered across the financial news as a disgraced corporate criminal, no office would hire him. He was forced to take a job working under the table at a bustling, high-end catering hall in the Upper East Side, a place where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their fortunes. It was a Saturday night, and the ballroom was packed. Richard was wearing an ill-fitting, stiff white uniform, his hands blistered and raw from scalding dishwater. He had been demoted from the kitchen to bussing tables due to his slow pace. He maneuvered through the crowded room, his back aching, carrying a heavy plastic tub filled with half-eaten food, discarded napkins, and dirty silverware. He approached a large round table to clear the salad plates. Sitting at the center was Charles Wentworth, one of his former key investors, and a man who had laughed alongside him at L'Etoile on the night he had humiliated Beatrice. Charles was holding court, loudly boasting about a recent corporate acquisition to a group of attentive sycophants. Richard kept his head down, praying he wouldn't be recognized. He reached across the table to grab a heavy porcelain plate. His hands, shaking from exhaustion and the sheer, crushing stress of his impending prison sentence, fumbled. The edge of the plate clipped a tall crystal wine glass filled with expensive Cabernet. The glass tipped over, shattering against the edge of the table. The dark red wine splashed violently across Charles Wentworth's pristine white tuxedo shirt and cascaded down onto his lap. The table went dead silent. Charles jumped to his feet, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. "Are you blind?" he roared, his voice echoing over the music. Richard froze, dropping the plastic tub to the floor with a loud clatter. I am so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I didn't mean to—" "Of course you didn't mean to," Charles interrupted, a cruel, mocking sneer stretching across his face. He leaned in close, completely failing to recognize the broken, haggard man standing before him. Meaning to do something implies foresight and competence, traits that are clearly absent in someone whose peak in life is carrying dirty plates. The words hit Richard with the physical force of a sledgehammer. It was a perfect, horrifying echo. "Look at this mess," Charles spat, pointing to the shattered glass on the polished floor. "Get on your knees and clean it up. Now, before I have the manager throw you out onto the street." Slowly, his knees trembling, Richard Sterling sank down onto the hard floor. He pulled a handful of cheap paper napkins from his apron and began to scrub the spilled wine, the shards of crystal cutting into his raw fingertips. As he knelt there, surrounded by the expensive shoes of the working elite, listening to the condescending laughter of the men above him, the full, crushing weight of his absolute ruin finally broke him. Karma had not been a swift lightning strike. It had been a slow, agonizing descent, forcing him to live inside the exact hell he had so casually created for others. The man who had once believed he owned the world was left scrubbing the floors of it, completely invisible, entirely powerless, and waiting for a prison cell that would become his final, permanent address. The spectacular downfall of Richard Sterling and the subsequent rise of Beatrice Hayes became a foundational legend in modern corporate history. It served as a permanent, terrifying reminder to the elite that arrogance is the most dangerous vulnerability in any system. True power is never loud, cruel, or dismissive. It operates quietly, building strength in the shadows until it is ready to strike. Beatrice did not destroy Richard. She simply handed him the consequences of his own hubris, proving that the people you step on today might be the ones holding the keys to your survival tomorrow. Ultimately, the story reinforced a universal truth. Cruelty is a luxury that no one, not even a billionaire, can afford forever.